Hey guys, how's it going? I'm back here with another video, and today this is the second episode of the series that I'm bringing to the channel where I'm gonna teach all of you guys GraphQL from the beginning until you get to a point where you're able to say to yourself that you actually understand GraphQL, you understand the reasons for why you might want to use it, you understand more than just writing the code for it, you actually understand what you're doing. And I really hope that it will come out that way. But I'm excited to bring this second episode because today we're actually going to start working a little bit with the GraphQL language, as I promised in the last video. I'm going to explain some stuff like go over the basic types, also go over a little bit of how the GraphQL schema is defined, so the structure of a GraphQL schema. And also at the end, I'm going to be using a public GraphQL API, as you can see over here. And with this API, we're going to be querying and fetching data using GraphQL. So I'm going to teach you guys the basics, so how to make like a basic query to an API. And if you're interested, the link for this API will be in the description. So you'll be able to go to this link over here where you can use this beautiful interface in order to make the requests. So I'm just going to open this up a little bit like this, so it becomes like full screen. So before we get into the video, if you guys could leave a like and subscribe, I would massively appreciate it because it would help push my videos to more people. I'm putting a lot of effort and I made a lot of research prior to starting this series because I really wanted to make a series that will bring you guys value and that will be easy for beginners to understand. So if you could help me out subscribing, leaving a like, I would massively appreciate it. So with that in mind, let's get into the tutorial. So as you can see over here, I opened up this this thing over here, this website. This is actually an online version of GraphQL Playground, which is kind of like it's a software which is kind of like Postman but for GraphQL. You can use Postman or other API testers to make GraphQL queries. However, I highly recommend using something like GraphQL Playground because it has a lot of built-in cool stuff that will help you throughout your way. So the thing is, it also exists inside of the browser, and we're going to be using GraphQL Playground later on in the series. However, for now, let's just use it like this to just test this API that I found online. So before we actually start querying the API, I'm going to go over just some of the basics, right? So some of the little small things that you need to understand about the GraphQL query language in order to get it going. So the first thing that we got to understand is GraphQL comes with 5 different like basic data types that comes with the language. Similar to like Java or other strictly typed languages, you need to define what your fields are. So there's a string, there's an int for integer, there's float for like decimals, and there's booleans for for a boolean, for a true or false statement. And GraphQL, it actually only exists this 5 types over here. The ID type is because since GraphQL is a query language and IDs are so common inside of like databases or any kind of request, they created this ID type, which basically is used for IDs. So it can be like a string or it can be a number, as you can see over here. It just expects something that will be accepted as an ID. And the good thing about GraphQL Playground, as you can see, is you can just hover over the thing and it will give you like a cool explanation of what it is. So I just wanted to get this out of the way. There's only 5 types inside of GraphQL that you can use. But you can see that I actually defined a new type over here, and I called it user. If you're used to something like, I don't know, just defining a database schema or using something like TypeScript, you're probably used to doing something like this. You create basically the structure of an object, and inside of it, you define all of the fields that this object will have and their types. And this is basically what we're doing. Imagine that in our API, we have a user we have user data. So with GraphQL, we need to define a type called user so that when we make a request that returns some sort of like the data for a user, GraphQL knows what a user is composed of. So it's very, very strictly typed in the sense that you always need to define exactly what you're going to return in this kind of ways. And the good thing is you define these types like this, but if you want to, for example, say that a user has a field called friends, right? Because I don't know, imagine this is a social media, and you want to say that each user has a couple friends, right? So what would the field friends be composed of? Well, each friend is a user. So technically friends should be of type list of users. But how can we do that? Because it is inside of the user type. How can we use the user type inside of itself? Well, in GraphQL, you can do that. You can just say that each user will have a list of users. And one of the things you need to learn is that if you want to say that something is a list, you define the type inside of it, and you use the brackets around it. Now, you might find something weird here. So I told you guys that there was only 5 basic types in GraphQL: string, ID, int, float, and boolean. But you see, I'm using user over here, which is exactly the point of GraphQL. You're supposed to use those basic types as part of your other types that you create, and then you can nest types that you create inside of each other. So I used user inside of user, and the good thing is when we access this friends field, we will have access to all of the other fields that each user has. So we can see if each friend is married, we can see the height for each friend, we can see the age, the name, all of this information exists inside of each type. So we can also access types and nest types that are different from each other. So for example, we'll create here a type called video. And imagine that this is YouTube all of a sudden, and we have a social media where you have a user and you have videos that you post. So the user type might have over here a field called videos posted. And by the name of it, it should be a list of videos. So we need to define our video type. So in our video, we can have an ID, which would be of type ID. We can have a title, which would be of type string. And for now, let's keep it simple. Let's just add a description, which would also be of type string. So what we can do is we can just come over here and do the exact same thing we did before, and just say that this is a list of video. And now we have nested the video type inside of the user type. And this will work perfectly because we can access all of this information. Now, it might seem like we're just defining stuff right now because we are. And I feel like it's important to go over this before we start fetching data. But when we start actually fetching data from this API, you guys will understand completely why it is important to understand the structure of your data. Because we're gonna be able to access all of this in a way that before starting working with GraphQL, I had never seen in REST. GraphQL abstracts some stuff that would be very difficult to do with REST, and I feel the need to emphasize how good some parts of this technology are. So you can see we defined this over here. And one thing I also want to talk about is you might be questioning, what are these exclamation marks over here? Well, GraphQL accepts either a value or null. So you can either give it two things. Either you can give it the type that we said a field is. So if we want to query a user, what we get from the API must be a string over here. And the reason why it must be a string is because we put this exclamation mark over here. But if we want to make a field be optional and we want to allow it to be null, we can just remove this over here. An example is in this user type, I only made one of them be allowed null, which is the field is married, because I don't know, I think in real life it might be weird to make it obligatory for you to put the information if you're married or not into a website. But you can see that if I wanted to create a user inside of my GraphQL API, I wouldn't need to actually put this information because it is nullable. Now over here, for both of this information over here, we have a list of friends and we have a list of videos. You can see that none of them have the exclamation mark. The good thing is that we really don't want to, because not all users will have friends. So technically for fields like this, we don't make the array be required. It just doesn't make sense. However, we might want to make the type inside of the array be required. So for example, we can say that it is not required for you to have a list of friends. It is not required for you to even have a friend. But if you have a friend, the user type must be provided. So you put an exclamation mark inside of here. If you wanted to make the array required as well, you can just put the exclamation mark after the array as well. But as I mentioned before, technically in websites, you don't need to make list of friends required. And the same thing goes with the videos posted. I don't really want to make it so that every user must post a video, but if they post a video, we want to make the field, the video type be required. We don't want to receive null videos. So you kind of are probably getting the gist of a bit of like how the language works, a bit of the basic types. By the way, types, I've used this word in this video. We call them scalars, the types that are already primitive to GraphQL. So the 5 ones that I mentioned previously, we call them scalars because they're not actually like a type composed of fields, but you can create your own scalars if you want to, and we're going to talk about that later on in the series as well. But now that we got the gist of this basic stuff over here, let's start actually working with the API that I mentioned. So in this video, we're going to be working with this API over here, which is one of the few public and free APIs I found that uses GraphQL. And what do I mean by that? Well, in order to use GraphQL to fetch data from an API, the API must support the GraphQL fetching method. So like the way that GraphQL fetches data. So either it has to be a REST API that communicates with the GraphQL layer and between the front end and the back end, or it must be just a GraphQL API built completely using GraphQL. So you can't just go and get any REST API and use GraphQL to fetch the data. And for that reason, there's just a limited amount of free public GraphQL APIs out there. But there's this one over here called Countries GraphQL API, which is really nice because it's really simple for this video. You can see that it just returns information about countries. And when I click on the link that they provided, I come to this page over here, which I mentioned previously. It's a way for us to test the API. And it is connected to the API publicly, as you can see over here, meaning that we can officially make requests to the API. So one thing I'm going to go over is every GraphQL API must have something called a schema. And the schema isn't the database schema, the same thing as a database schema, because GraphQL has nothing to do with your database. It's just a schema that defines all of the data that will exist inside of the API. And one thing that is important to understand is that every GraphQL schema will have a root type called query. And this root type will contain a bunch of fields similar, and it is a type. It's called it's a type like this, and its name will be query. So every GraphQL API must have this type, and inside of here you'll have each field will be something like I don't know, get users, which is a query. So you should list all of the queries that you might want to make from the front end to request data for the API. Usually don't call it like this, like get users. This is more common with REST APIs. Instead, what you do is, if I want to make a request in the front end to get a list of users, we should probably have a field in our query type called users with an S at the end. And what it should return is a list of user, similar to what I've mentioned before. Now, if we want to just query information about a specific user, we can do something like this. We can say that this field is user without an S at the end because it makes sense. It's an individual user. And what we can do as well is we can actually put variables that are arguments to a query. So if I want to query a specific user, I can say that I want to query a user by ID. So I can say something like this. ID equals to, I don't know, of type ID. And I'm just saying that if I want to query a user, I have to pass an ID, which is of type ID. And at the end, this query will return a type of type user, like this. So I just wanted to mention this before we take a look at the schema. But basically, this is how you lay out all the different queries that you might make to your API. And you'll see this inside of this API. Because one of the good things about GraphQL Playground is that when you connect to a public API or to any other GraphQL API, it actually generates a beautiful layout of the schema for that specific API. And if I click on this button over here, I can just see the whole GraphQL schema defined in front of me. Now, this API obviously has a lot of stuff. It was actually built by really good developers, so it definitely has a lot of fields, and I don't want to confuse you guys, so if you see something that you don't understand, don't worry, you're going to understand all of this by the end of the series. However, I want to bring into attention stuff that I already explained to you guys. So for example, if we come down here, you can see that indeed inside of this schema, there is a type called query. And this query over here, this type, defines all of the different API requests that you can make to this GraphQL API. So you can query information about continents. So apparently, based on what I taught you guys, this kind of looks like a query that returns a list of continents, right? Of a type called continent that they created on the schema. You can also just get an individual continent, and you can see that we can pass an ID, a code, which is of type ID, to get that specific continent. And it returns just a single continent, not a list of continents. There's also other fields and other queries you can make. You can make a query to countries, to a country, to languages, to a language. But basically, you can see that these are all of the queries that you can make, all of the data that you can request inside of this API. And there's some minor things that I want to point out. You can see that for some of the fields, it's not actually, as an argument, they don't actually have like a code with an ID or something like that. They actually have something called filter, which you can actually define types for your arguments, and they're called inputs. So if, for example, I wanted more than just a code to use as the variable for making this request, I can create an object containing all of the fields that I need to make this request, and I can just create them and turn them into an input. And an input is defined like this. So for example, if I come over here, close this, and I just open this again, and I wanted to create over here a query that returns information about a user. But for some reason, I don't just need an ID for this to work. I actually need an ID and the name of the user. Well, I can do it in both ways. I can actually just come over here and also define the name of the user and say that it also takes a name as a variable, and name is a string. Or I can just create an input over here and call it I don't know, user input. You can call it whatever you want. And over here I can define ID as of type ID and name as type string. And then instead of passing this like this, I can just pass the input as type user input, and it does the exact same thing. It's just a way to organize your queries. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at this API. So as I mentioned over here, we have the following queries. We can query for continents, we can query for a specific continent, we can query for countries, and for languages. Let me try initially querying for a specific country. You can see that to get this, to make this query, you need to pass in a code, which is the ID of the country. So like for Brazil, it would be BR. For US, would be US. For other countries, they have their specific codes. You can take a look at, like, just search on Google, like, a country code for a specific country. And from what I'm seeing, you just pass that code and it should return a country. But what exactly is a country? Let's take a look at how they define a country. So over here, they define a country as an object, right, a type, that includes their code, the name of the country, apparently native, which I'm not really sure what it is, the phone, which I guess it's the phone code, the continent in which the country is inside of, its capital, its currency, a lot of stuff, right? We can get a lot of information. So let's try running this query. How do we query information using GraphQL? Well, if we have this request over here, we have this API done over here, all we have to do is, first of all, open and close curly braces like this. And why do we do this? The way you make queries for a schema in GraphQL is you basically lay out all of the fields of an object that you want to receive. So by default, at the root of all of this, there's the query. So we're just saying what we want to get from the root query. And by opening and closing curly braces like this, we're already saying that we're trying to grab one of these fields over here. So we specify which field we want. So I want the country. So I just come over here and write country. Now country requires an argument. So I can just pass in the argument, which is code. And I can pass the code for this country. Let's try querying the US. So I'm going to put US over here. Now, country as a field returns a type that is not one of the GraphQL native types. It's not like a string or anything like that. It's a type that was created inside of GraphQL. So it is a type that was created inside of this schema. So in order to actually get this information, whenever we have a type, like a field that returns a type that isn't one of the basic types from GraphQL, we actually need to specify what we want from that type. So to specify, we open and close curly braces again. So for each field that you want to get information from, you just open and close curly braces and specify which fields you want. So country should return a country type. So let's go to the country type. The country type has all of these fields. So we specify which fields we want. Let me get the ID, which is actually called code. Let me get the name of the country. And you can just list out whatever you want. Let me try to get the phone. Let me try to get the capital. Let me try to get the currency, whatever you want. And if you want to run this query, all you have to do is you just have to click on this button over here, and it should run the query. And every GraphQL query gives a similar response in the sense that the format of the response will include an object, which the first field will be a data field, and inside of the data field will include the data that you queried. So the data field will always return in the format starting from the root query, this type over here, the one that I said that every GraphQL schema must have. So initially, we say that we want to get the country from the root query, so this one over here, and the country type, the data that was returned was the code, the name, the phone, the capital, and the currency, because those are the ones we specified, and we can get this information. Now, I did leave out some of the types that country included because I wanted to point out something. You can see that, for example, continent as a field isn't a basic type from GraphQL. It's actually a type called continent that was created by this API. So let's take a look at the type continent. Well, the type continent includes a code, a name, and a country's field. So if I wanted to come over here and say that from my API request, I also want to get the continent from this query, I couldn't just do it like this. You see, it will give us an error because we need to specify what from this continent I want to get. So I want to get the code, I want to get the name, and I want to get the countries inside of this continent. Oh wait, but again, name and code are fine because name and code are types that are basic to GraphQL, but countries is actually a list of the country type. So we need to specify again what we want for each country in this list. So let's just get the name of the country, and what we're going to get if we run this over here is we're actually going to get the United States, then we're going to get like all the information that we had previously, but now we're getting the continent field, and inside of this continent field we get the code NA for North America, which is the continent where the US is located at, and then the name North America, and then we get a list of countries, and each country only returns the name. So this is one of the good things that I mentioned in the previous video, where you can specify in the front end, in the place where you're making the API request, what you're trying to get, so that you only download the data that you need. So if I wanted to get more, I wanted to get like let me try to get also the capital for each country inside of the countries list. So let me just come over here and say capital. You can just specify capital, and now all of the countries also include its capital. So it's nice, right? You have all of these objects and types that are nested inside of each other, and when you query information, you can just get this data like this. Now, the structure is a bit hard to get used to. I understand that it's much easier to just get used to making like a fetch request, like an API request, a GET request, to an endpoint and specifying what you want in the backend, what you want to send in the backend. However, with this, it becomes so much easier once you start getting the gist of it, because you're just telling GraphQL what fields you want, and it will literally give it to you without any actual work from the backend. So now the final thing I want to do is just a little exercise to see if you guys understood completely everything that we explained in this video. By the way, I'll be responding every question you guys leave in the comments, at least until a point, because I really like teaching about GraphQL, I really like talking about GraphQL. So if you have any doubts, I'm super free to answer, because I'm actually really excited to help you guys with this series overall. So the last exercise that I want to talk about is instead of querying a country, let's try to go over here, go to the root query type again, and let's query the languages field over here. So if you want to pause for a second, you can see that this is one of the fields. It does return a list of languages, and there's the language type exists over here, so just check it out. Take a look at what fields you want. And also keep in mind that there's an input over here called filter. So you need to take a look at what language filter input is. And apparently it's this over here. But my recommendation is that just ignore this. You can see that there isn't actually an exclamation mark over here, which means that you don't need to pass this variable as an argument. You can just query for languages and it will return the information. You don't need to pass an argument. Differently from like if you pass for stuff like continent or country where the ID is required, you don't need to actually pass anything. And I would just ignore this for a second. Just try returning a list of all the languages inside of this API. And pause the video, do that. If you get stuck, don't worry. I'll be here to help you out. Just comment anything and I'll be able to answer. But I'll show you guys how to do this in a second. So if you paused or you didn't, it doesn't really matter. I'm going to explain to you how to actually do this and make a request to query the languages list. So as I mentioned before, inside of this over here, whenever you want to make a request to a GraphQL schema, you need to assume that it's already in the root type called query. And this query type, and that means that you can just specify directly by opening and closing curly braces which fields inside of the query type you want to get, right? So over here we just want the languages field like this. And again, we're not passing, we don't need to do something like this because this is optional and I really don't care that much. I don't want to specify any filter that I want to pass to this languages. I just want to receive the list of all the languages. So I can just open and close curly braces again because this returns a list of a type which isn't a scalar type called language. So we go over here and we specify what we want to receive from each language. So from each language, I just want to get their names. So let me get name. Then let me get the code as well over here. Then let me get native, which I really don't know what it means, but let's see what it is. And RTL, which I also don't know what that means, but let's see what it is. And if this is right, it should return a list of all the languages inside of this API. And for each language, there should be a code, a name, a native, and an RTL. Let's click run. And you can see that apparently this is what happens. We receive in the response an object with a field called data and then a field called languages because it's what we're querying. And then inside of it, there's a list of languages. And each language includes a code, a name, and a native, which I guess it's like maybe the native way of writing the language name. Yeah, probably. And RTL, I have no idea what it is, but you can see that this is working. And if you were able to do this, that's awesome because it means you're starting to get at least the basics of the GraphQL query language. And that was my hope for this video. Feel free to ask anything in the comment down below. As I mentioned, I'll be able to answer everything. I'm here to help you guys. I'm really excited for the series, and I really hope this was a valuable video. In the next episodes, I'm going to show you guys how to build an actual GraphQL API. So we're actually going to be writing code, and I'm really excited for that. I thought it would be nice to actually present this before we get to that point because I just feel like that would be not a lot of people do that, and I feel like if you go directly to the code, you will start getting really confused with stuff like this. And I feel like if I did it this way, it would have been more beneficial. So if you're interested in giving me any opinions, feel free to do so. I really want to make this the best series ever, so let me know in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and comment what you want to see next. Subscribe because I'm posting 2 to 3 times a week, and I would massively appreciate it if you guys could support the channel. And yeah, that's basically it. I really hope you guys enjoyed it, and I see you guys next time.